why do we go to war? I mean, really, why? It's one of those questions that has haunted humanity forever. For centuries, people have been trying to figure out its roots, not just to win conflicts, but, hopefully to prevent them altogether. So let's see if we can piece this incredibly complex puzzle together.
It's kind of wild to think about, but historically, war wasn't always seen as this absolute failure. Some thinkers, like Heinrich von Treitschke here, actually saw it as a tool, a harsh but necessary remedy to shake things up and drive history forward. The idea was that war was the midwife of change, breaking down old, stagnant systems to make way for the new.
But that idea feels completely wrong today, doesn't it? I mean, especially after the 20th century, with 2 world wars and the invention of nuclear weapons, we see war for what it is, an absolute catastrophe. It's not a remedy, it's a global disease with devastating symptoms.
So if we stick with that medical analogy, right? If we want to prevent the disease of war, we have to understand what actually causes it in the first place. We've got to diagnose the problem at every single level, and that's exactly what we're going to try to do here.
Let's start by zooming all the way in, to the most basic level, the individual, you and me. Are the seeds of war buried deep down inside human nature itself? So, this gets us to a huge debate. On one side, you've got thinkers like Sigmund Freud, who argued that humans have a death instinct, that aggression is just baked into our biology. But on the other side, you have a lot of people who argue that war is just a social invention, a really bad habit that we've learned, which means it can be unlearned through things like education and changing our culture.
And building on that, there's something called the frustration-aggression theory. The idea here is pretty simple. When a person, or even an entire nation, is blocked from getting what it wants, that frustration can boil over into aggression. Just think about Germany after World War I. They were dealing with economic collapse, national humiliation, and all that collective frustration was channeled into horrifying aggression.
But here's the thing. Sometimes war isn't really about aggression or evil intent at all. Sometimes it's about getting things profoundly wrong. A simple but catastrophic miscalculation by leaders who are seeing the world through their own biased lenses.
Take, for example, the Falklands War in 1982. Argentinian leaders just did not believe the UK would go to war to defend those tiny islands. They completely misjudged British resolve, and that single mistake led to a conflict.
Then, just a few years later, Saddam Hussein totally misread the room. He thought he could get away with invading Kuwait, and he just didn't see the massive international coalition that would form to push him out. Another huge misjudgment.
And of course, a more recent example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It was launched based on the perception that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to be a monumental error in judgment, with consequences that lasted for years.
Okay, so from the individual mind, let's zoom out a bit. Let's look at the dynamics between groups, between tribes, and of course, between nations. War is almost always a group activity. And one of the most powerful drivers for conflict is that simple, primal us versus them thinking. When our collective identity, whether it's national, religious, or ethnic, becomes the main way we see the world, things can get dangerous fast. The Rwandan genocide in 1994, which was driven entirely by ethnic hatred, is just a terrifying example of this.
Now, on a more hopeful note, there's this really fascinating idea called the democratic peace theory, and the data pretty much backs it up. Established democracies almost never go to war with each other, but, and this is a really big but, they are still very willing to go to war with non-democratic states, as we saw in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.
So, if war is so incredibly costly and destructive, why don't countries just negotiate a deal instead? Well, political scientist James Fearon had a great answer. He argued that war is actually a rational choice that happens when bargaining fails, and it usually fails for one of 3 reasons. 1, uncertainty, which is just like the misperceptions we talked about. 2, commitment problems, where you just can't trust the other side to keep its promises down the road. Or 3, indivisible issues, things like a holy city that neither side is willing to split.
All right, for our final level, let's zoom out one last time to the big picture, the international system itself. What if war isn't caused by bad people or bad states, but by the very structure of the world we live in? This brings us to a really crucial idea called the security dilemma. See, in a world with no global police force, no one to call for help, every country has to fend for itself. So, when one country builds up its military to feel safer, its neighbors get nervous and, well, they build up their armies too. Now the first country feels less safe than before, so it builds up even more, and you can see how this spirals. It's a trap. really. And a perfect example of this is the naval arms race between Britain and Germany before World War I. Every new battleship Germany built was seen as a direct threat by Britain, and vice versa. It created this spiral of fear and hostility that helped pave the road to war, even if neither side actually wanted a war to begin with.
So, we've looked at causes inside of us, between our groups, and in the system all around us. How on earth do we pull all of this together to think about a path towards peace?
Well, what becomes pretty clear is that a multi-level problem needs multi-level solutions. There's no single magic bullet here. To fight individual misperceptions, we need things like education and diplomacy. To fix state-level bargaining failures, we need to promote democratic norms. And to manage that system-level security dilemma, we have to rely on international law, arms control, and stable alliances.
And this kind of brings us to our final thought. The good news is that large-scale wars between countries are, thankfully, becoming rarer. But the nature of conflict itself is changing. The future might be defined less by massive armies crossing borders and more by civil wars, ethnic conflicts, and totally new battlefields like cyberspace. The root causes might be the same, but the battlefield is evolving. So the question is, are we ready for what comes next?